In characterizing the connection between care and selfhood, our aim was not only to clarify the special problem of I-hood, but also to help in the final preparation for phenomenally grasping the wholeness of the structural whole of Dasein. We need the unwavering discipline of the existential line of questioning if, for our ontological viewpoint, the kind of being of Dasein is not finally to be distorted into a mode of objective presence, even if it is a completely indifferent mode. Dasein becomes essential in authentic existence that is constituted as anticipatory resoluteness. This mode of the authenticity of care contains the primordial self-constancy and totality of Dasein. We must take an undistracted look at these and understand them existentially if we are to expose the ontological meaning of the being of Dasein. What are we looking for ontologically with the meaning of care? What does meaning sin signify bidutat? Our inquiry encountered this phenomenon in the context of the analysis of understanding and interpretation. 22, according to that analysis, meaning is that in which the intelligibility of something keeps itself, without coming into view explicitly and thematically itself. Meaning signifies that upon which the primary project is projected, that in terms of which something can be conceived in its possibility as what it is. Projecting discloses possibilities, that is, it discloses what makes something possible. To expose that upon which a project is projected means to disclose what makes what is projected possible. This exposure requires that we methodologically pursue the project, usually one that is unexpressed, underlying an interpretation in such a way that what is projected in the project is disclosed and conceivable with regard to its upon which. To set forth the meaning of care, then, means to pursue the project underlying and guiding the primordial existential interpretation of Dasein in such a way that its upon which becomes visible in what is projected. What is projected is the being of Dasein, disclosed in what constitutes it as an authentic potentiality for being whole. The upon which of what is projected, of the disclosed being thus constituted, is what itself makes possible this constitution of being as care. With the question of the meaning of care, we are asking what makes possible the wholeness of the articulated structural whole of care in the unity of its unfolded articulation. Strictly speaking, meaning signifies the upon which of the primary project of the understanding of being. Being in the world that is disclosed to itself, equiprimordially understands the being of interworldly beings together with the being of the being that it itself is, although unthematically and not yet differentiated into its primary modes of existence and reality. All ontic experience of beings, the circumspect calculation of things at hand, as well as the positive scientific cognition of things objectively present, is always grounded in the more or less transparent projects of the beings in question. But these projects hide in themselves and upon which, from which, so to speak, the understanding of being nourishes itself. If we say that beings have meaning, this signifies that they have become accessible in their being, and this being projected upon its upon which is what really has meaning first of all. Beings have meaning only because, as being that has been disclosed beforehand, they become intelligible in the project of that being sane, that is, in terms of the upon which of this project. The primary project of the understanding of being gives meaning. The question of the meaning of the being of a being takes as its theme the upon which of the understanding of being that underlies all being of being. Dasein is disclosed to itself authentically or inauthentically with regard to its existence. Existing, it understands itself in such a way that this understanding does not just grasp something, but constitutes the existential being of its factical potentiality of being. The being that is disclosed is that of a being that is concerned about its being. The meaning of this being, that is, care is what makes care possible in its constitution, and it is what primordially makes up the being sane of this potentiality of being. The meaning of being of Dasein is not something different from it, unattached and outside of it, rather, it is self-understanding Dasein itself. What makes possible the being of Dasein, and thus its factical existence. What is projected in the primordial existential project of existence revealed itself as anticipatory, what makes possible this authentic being whole of Dasein with regard to the unity of its articulated structural whole. Expressed formally and existentially, without constantly naming the complete structural content, anticipatory resoluteness is the being toward one's own most eminent potentiality of being. Something like this is possible only in that Dasein can come toward itself at all in its own most possibility, and hold itself in this possibility as possibility in this letting itself come toward itself. In other words, in that it exists. This letting come toward itself of the eminent possibility that it endures is the primordial phenomenon of the future. If authentic or inauthentic being toward death belongs to the being of Dasein, this is possible only as futural in the sense indicated now, and to be more closely defined later. Here, future does not mean a now that has not yet become actual, and that sometime will be for the first time, but the coming in which Dasein comes toward itself in its own most potentiality of being. Anticipation makes Dasein authentically futural in such a way that anticipation itself is possible only in that Dasein, as existing, always already comes toward itself, that is futural in its being in general. Anticipatory resoluteness understands Dasein in its essential being guilty. This understanding means taking over being guilty and existing to be the throne ground of nullity. But to take over thrownness means to authentically be Dasein in the way that it always already was. Taking over thrownness, however, is possible only in such a way that futural Dasein can be its own most, how it always already was, that is, its having been. Only because Dasein in general is as I am having been, can it come futurally toward itself in such a way that it comes back. Authentically futural, Dasein is authentically having been. Anticipation of the most extreme and almost possibility comes back understandingly to one's almost having been. Dasein can be authentically having been only because it is futural. In a certain sense, having been arises from the future. Anticipatory resoluteness discloses the actual situation of the there, in such a way that existence circumspectly takes care of the factical things at hand in the surrounding world in action. Resolute being together with what is at hand in the situation, that is, letting what presences anwescendent in the surrounding world be encountered in action, is possible only in a making that being present gegenwart. Only as the present gegenwart, in the sense of making present, can resoluteness be what it is, namely, letting what it takes hold of in action be encountered undistortedly. Coming back to itself, from the future's Zukunftig, resoluteness brings itself to the situation in making it present. Having been arises from the future in such a way that the future that has been, or better, is in the process of having been, releases the present from itself. This unified phenomenon of the future that makes present in the process of having been is what we call temporality. Only because Dasein is determined, as temporality does it make possible for itself, the authentic potentiality of being a whole of anticipatory resoluteness, which we characterize. Temporality reveals itself as the meaning of authentic care. The phenomenal content of this meaning, drawn from the constitution of being of anticipatory resoluteness, fulfills the significance of the term temporality. We must now keep the terminological use of this expression at a distance from all of the meanings of future, past, and present, initially urging themselves upon us from the vulgar concept of time. That is also true of the concepts of a subjective and an objective, or an immanent and transcendent, time. Since Dasein understands itself initially, and for the most part inauthentically, we may suppose that the time of the vulgar understanding of time indeed presents a genuine phenomenon, but a derivative one. It arises from inauthentic temporality that has an origin of its own. The concepts of future, past, and present initially grew out of the inauthentic understanding of time. The terminological definition of the corresponding primordial and authentic phenomena battles with the same difficulty in which all ontological terminology is stuck. In this field of inquiry, forcing things is not an arbitrary matter, but a necessity rooted in facts. However, in order to demonstrate seamlessly the origin of inauthentic temporality from primordial and authentic temporality, we first need to work out the primordial phenomenon concretely, which we have thus far only sketched out roughly. If resoluteness constitutes the mode of authentic care, and if it is itself possible only through temporality, the phenomenon at which we arrive by considering resoluteness must itself only present a modality of temporality, which makes care possible in general. The wholeness of the being of Dasein as care means, ahead of itself already being in, a world, as being together with beings encountered within the world. When we first established this articulated structure, we referred to the fact that, with regard to this articulation, the ontological question had to be taken back further to the exposition of the unity of the wholeness of the structural. The primordial unity of the structure of care lies in temporality. Being ahead of oneself is grounded in the future. Already being in makes known having been. Being together with is made possible in making present. After what we have said, it is automatically ruled out to conceive the ahead in the ahead of itself, and the already in terms of the vulgar understanding of time. The ahead does not mean the before, in the sense of a not yet now, but later. Nor does the already mean a no longer now but earlier. If the expressions ahead of and already had this temporal meaning, which they can also have, then we would be saying about the temporality of care that it is something that is earlier and later, not yet and no longer at the same time. Then care would be conceived as a being that occurs and elapses in time. The being of a being having the character of Dasein would then turn into something objectively present. If something like this is impossible, then the temporal significance of these expressions must be a different one. The before and the ahead of indicate the future that first makes possible in general the fact that Dasein can be in such a way that it is concerned about its potentiality of being. The self-project grounded in the, for the sake of itself, in the future is an essential quality of existentiality. Its primary meaning is the future. Similarly, the already means the existential, temporal meaning of being saints and of the being that, in that it is always already something thrown. Only because care is grounded in having been, can Dasein exist as the throne being that it is. As long as Dasein factically exists, it is never past, but is always already having been in the sense of I am as having been. And only as long as Dasein is, can it be as having been. On the other hand, we call beings past that are no longer objectively present. Thus existing Dasein can never identify Feststil in itself as an objectively present fact that comes into being and passes away, with time, and is already partially past. It always finds itself only as a thrown fact. In attunement, Dasein is invaded by itself as the being that, still existing saying it, already was, that is, that it constantly is as having been. Primary existential meaning of facticity lies in having been. The formulation of the structure of care indicates the temporal meaning of existentiality of facticity with the expressions before and already. On the other hand, such an indication is lacking for the third constitutive factor of care, entangled being together with. That is not supposed to mean that falling prey is not also grounded in temporality. It should instead intimate that making present, as the primary basis for the falling prey to things at hand and objectively present that we take care of, remains included in the future and in having been in the mode of primordial temporality. Resolute Dasein has brought itself back out of falling prey in order to be all the more authentically there, for the disclosed situation in the moment, Augenblick. Temporality makes possible the unity of existence, facticity, and falling prey, and thus constitutes primordially the wholeness of the structure of care. The factors of care are not pieced together cumulatively, any more than temporality itself has first been put together out of future, past, and present in the course of time. Temporality is not a being science at all. It is not, but rather temporalizes itself. Nevertheless, we still cannot avoid saying that temporality is the meaning of care. Temporality is determined thus and so. The reason for this can be made intelligible only when we have clarified the idea of being and the is as such. Temporality temporalizes, and it temporalizes possible ways of itself. These make possible the multiplicity of the modes of being of Dasein, in particular the fundamental possibility of authentic and inauthentic existence. Future having been and present show the phenomenal characteristics of toward itself, back to, letting something be encountered. The phenomena of toward to, together with, reveal temporality as the par excellence. Temporality is the primordial, outside of itself, in and for itself. Thus we call the phenomena of future, having been, and present the ecstasies of temporality. Temporality is not, prior to this, a being that first emerges from itself, rather, its essence is temporalizing in the unity of the ecstasy. What is characteristic of the time, accessible to the vulgar understanding consists, among other things, precisely in the fact that it is a pure succession of nows, without beginning and without end, in which the ecstatic character of primordial temporality is leveled down. But this very leveling down, in accordance with its existential meaning, is grounded in the possibility of a definite kind of temporalizing, in conformity with which temporality temporalizes as inauthentic the kind of time we have just mentioned. Thus, if we demonstrate that the time accessible to the common sense of Dasein is not primordial, but arises rather from authentic temporality, then, according to the principle apodere fit denominatio, we are justified in calling the temporality now set forth primordial time. In enumerating the ecstasies, we have always mentioned the future first. That should indicate that the future has priority in the ecstatic unity of primordial and authentic temporality, although temporality does not first originate through a cumulative sequence of the ecstasies, but always temporalizes itself in their equiprimordiality. But within this equiprimordiality, the modes of temporalizing are different. And the difference lies in the fact that temporalizing can be primarily determined out of the different ecstasy. Primordial and authentic temporality temporalizes itself out of the authentic future, and indeed in such a way that, futurally having been, it first arouses the present. The primary phenomenon of primordial and authentic temporality is the future. The priority of the future will itself vary according to the modified temporalizing of inauthentic temporality, but it will still make its appearance in derivative time. Care is being toward death. We defined anticipatory resoluteness as authentic being toward the possibility that we characterized as the absolute impossibility of Dasein. In this being toward the end, Dasein exists authentically and wholly as the being that it can be when thrown into death. It does not have an end where it just stops, but it exists finitely. The authentic future, which is temporalized primarily by that temporality which constitutes the meaning of anticipatory resoluteness, thus reveals itself as finite. But does time not go on, despite the no longer being there of myself? And can there not be an unlimited number of things that still lie in the future and arrive from it? These questions are to be answered in the affirmative. Nevertheless, they do not contain any objection to the finitude of primordial temporality, because they no longer deal with that at all. The question is not how many things can still occur in a time that goes on, or about what kind of a letting come toward oneself we can encounter out of this time, but about how the coming toward oneself itself is to be primordially determined as such. Its finitude does not primarily mean a stopping, but is a characteristic of temporalizing itself. The primordial and authentic future is the toward oneself, existing as the possibility of an insuperable nullity. The ecstatic quality of the primordial future lies precisely in the fact that it closes the potentiality of being. That is, the future is itself closed, and as such makes possible the resolute existential understanding of nullity. Primordial and authentic coming toward oneself is the meaning of existing in one's almost nullity. With the thesis of the primordial finitude of temporality, we are not contesting the fact that time goes on. We are simply holding fast to the phenomenal quality of primordial temporality that shows itself in what is projected in the primordial existential project of Dasein. The temptation to overlook the finitude of the primordial and authentic future, and thus the finitude of temporality, or to think that it is a priori impossible, arises from the constant intrusion of the vulgar understanding of time. If the latter is justifiably familiar with an endless time, and only with that, it has not yet been demonstrated that it also understands this time and its infinity. What does it mean to say that time goes on and keeps passing away? What does in time mean in general and in the future, and out of the future in particular? In what sense is time endless? These things require clarification if the vulgar objections to the finitude of primordial time are not to remain without foundation. But we can clear them up only if we have obtained the appropriate line of questioning with regard to finitude and infinitude. However, this line of questioning arises only if we view the primordial phenomenon of time understanding. The problem is not how does derivative, infinite time, in which objectively present things come into being and pass away, become primordial finite temporality, but rather, how does inauthentic temporality as inauthentic temporalize an infinite time out of finite time? Only because primordial time is finite can derivative time temporalize itself as infinite. In the order in which we grasp things through the understanding, the finitude of time does not become fully visible until we have set forth endless time, so that these may be contrasted. Let us summarize the analysis of primordial temporality in the following theses. Time is primordial as the temporalizing of temporality, and makes possible the constitution of the structure of care. Temporality is essentially ecstatic. Temporality temporalizes itself primordially out of the future. Primordial time is finite. Yet the interpretation of care as temporality cannot remain restricted to the narrow basis we have so far attained, even if it did take the first steps toward the primordial, authentic being whole of Dasein. The thesis that the meaning of Dasein is temporality must be confirmed by the concrete content of the fundamental constitution of this being which we have set forth.